On a cold morning in November 1740, a crowd gathered at Tyburn in London to witness a hanging. It was a ritual the city knew well. The condemned were paraded in carts, jeered at, prayed over, and finally dropped from the gallows. That day's main attraction was William Duell, a 17-year-old boy sentenced to death for rape and murder. The execution went as expected. The trap was sprung, Duell swung from the rope, and soon his limp body was cut down. He was pronounced dead, carried off to the surgeons, and laid on the table for dissection. But then something strange happened. As the surgeons prepared their tools, William Duell began to move. His chest heaved. His eyes fluttered. His body, supposedly lifeless, was very much alive. London's execution had failed. The dead boy had returned. Who was William Duell? Duell was hardly a sympathetic figure. He was young, but his crimes were brutal. Convicted alongside others, he was charged with rape and murder, crimes that in 18th century England meant certain death. At the time, executions weren't just punishment, they were spectacle. Crowds gathered in the thousands to watch justice carried out. And Duell's youth only made the case more sensational. When the sentence came down, hanging at Tyburn, no one doubted his fate. Hanging at Tyburn was infamous. For centuries, it had been the site of London's hangings, a grim carnival where justice met theater. The condemned were carted through the streets, sometimes jeered, sometimes pitted, but always watched. On the gallows, William Duell joined several other condemned prisoners. Ropes were fastened, prayers muttered, and at the appointed moment, the hangman's work began. The drop was short, as it often was in the 18th century. The condemned didn't die instantly from a broken neck. Instead, they strangled slowly, kicking and gasping until the life went out of them. For Duell, the struggle ended after minutes. His body went limp. The crowd accepted what it always accepted. Death had come. He was cut down, placed in a coffin, and prepared for the next stage of his punishment, dissection. The surgeon's table by law, certain executed criminals were handed over to surgeons. Their bodies became tools for teaching anatomy. It was considered an extra punishment, denying the dead a proper Christian burial and turning them into public specimens. William Duell's corpse was carried to the Royal College of Surgeons, laid out on a table, and surrounded by doctors ready to begin their work. But as they readied their instruments, they noticed something unusual. The corpse was breathing. The revival at first, it must have seemed impossible. A boy who had just dangled from Tyburn, declared dead before a crowd, now stirring beneath their hands? But the truth was undeniable. His chest rose and fell. His eyelids flickered. A faint pulse beat in his neck. William Duell was alive. What had happened was simple, if horrifying. The execution had been botched. The short drop had left him unconscious, but not truly dead. With air and time, his body revived. The surgeons pulled back. What were they to do? Their subject wasn't a corpse at all, but a boy who had somehow cheated the hangman. The law's dilemma here was the problem. Duell had been sentenced to hang, and hang he had. The law did not provide instruction for what to do if the condemned inconveniently survived. Was he to be hanged again? Was he free, having technically suffered his punishment? Or did the government invent some middle ground? The question spread quickly from the dissection room to the courts of London. And soon, William Duell's case became one of the strangest legal debates of the 18th century. Closing of Section 1, so by the end of that November day in 1740, London had a miracle or a nightmare on its hands. A 17-year-old criminal, hanged at Tyburn, declared dead before a crowd, and laid on the surgeon's table, had come back to life. The boy who had gone to the gallows now sat breathing once more. And the government had to decide, would William Duell hang again, or would he be spared? In Section 2, we'll see how the law wrestled with the case, how the public reacted, and how Duell's bizarre survival turned him into one of history's most famous execution survivors. Because sometimes, even death itself wasn't enough to end a sentence. When William Duell gasped back to life on the surgeon's table, London didn't know whether to cheer or shudder. Here was a boy of 17 who had just dangled from the gallows in front of a jeering crowd, declared dead, carted away, and prepared for dissection. And yet he was breathing, blinking, moving. It was a story too shocking to keep quiet. Within hours, news spread across the city. The boy who was supposed to die had cheated death. A legal headache. The law of 18th century England was brutal but clear. William Duell had been sentenced to hang until dead. And yet, he wasn't dead. What now? Some argued he should simply be taken back to Tyburn and strung up again. After all, he hadn't technically completed his sentence. But others thought differently. The sentence had been carried out. The rope had done its work. If Duell's body had somehow revived, perhaps Providence had spoken. It was a strange legal limbo, a boy neither fully alive in the eyes of justice, nor properly dead. The public's fascination. Londoners were captivated. The spectacle of executions was already a kind of theater, but Duell's revival was something new. Pamphlets circulated, gossip spread, and the story was retold in taverns. Was it a miracle? A botched job by a careless hangman? Or divine intervention? God sparing a sinner? For many, the idea that someone could survive the noose was terrifying. If death itself could be defied, what did that say about the justice of man? The authorities decide. The government moved quickly. A second execution would have been scandalous, risking more outrage and mockery. Letting him go free was unthinkable. He was, after all, a convicted rapist and murderer. Instead, the courts found a compromise. William Duell's sentence was commuted from death to transportation for life. He would be shipped off to the colonies, far from London, far from the stage of his miraculous survival. No more crowds, no more headlines, no more gallows. Just exile. Transportation, worse than death? Transportation in the 18th century was no mercy. Convicts were packed onto ships, chained in filthy holds, and sent across the ocean, usually to America and later to Australia. Many died on the voyage. Those who survived faced brutal servitude, forced labor, and little chance of return. For William Duell, survival may have felt less like a miracle and more like a cruel twist. He had cheated death at Tyburn, only to be sentenced to a slower, harsher fate overseas. The legacy of a survivor, what became of William Duell after transportation, isn't entirely clear. Records fade, and his name disappears from London's annals. Perhaps he perished at sea, perhaps in servitude, perhaps he lived a quiet, anonymous life far from home. But his bizarre story endured. For centuries, his case was cited as an example of how executions could fail, how the rope and the hangman weren't always final. His name appeared in histories of crime, in medical writings, and in folklore about men who could not be killed. The broader lesson. Duell's survival also highlighted something uncomfortable about justice in his era. Hangings weren't scientific. They were messy, inconsistent, and often botched. The short drop method used in the 18th century was unreliable, leaving the condemned to strangle slowly, or, in rare cases, revive later. The case became a reminder that death itself could be uncertain, and that the machinery of justice was far from infallible. From horror to folklore over time, William Duell became less a criminal and more a character in London's strange folklore. He wasn't remembered for his crimes so much as for the shocking image of a boy waking up under the surgeon's knife. His story lived on as one of the strangest footnotes in British history. The boy who went to the gallows was declared dead and then got up again. Closing of Section 2, so here's the final tally. William Duell, a teenage criminal, hanged at Tyburn in 1740. Declared dead before a crowd, carried to the surgeon's table. Moments before dissection, he revived. The law panicked, the people gossiped, and the government commuted his sentence to exile. He escaped the rope, but not his punishment. And yet his survival became legend, proof that sometimes even death itself could be cheated, if only briefly. The man who survived execution never returned to London's stage, but his story did. Because in history, there are few tales stranger than a corpse that refused to stay dead.